The Sherman tank. Why inferior won the war. Normandy, July 1944. An American armored column moves through the hedgerows. The lead vehicle is not massive. It is not heavily armored. It does not carry the largest gun on the battlefield. It is an M4 Sherman. For decades, the Sherman has been described with a single word: inferior, undergunned against Panthers, under-armored against Tigers, prone to burning when penetrated. Its nickname, Ronson, has entered popular memory as proof of failure. Yet, by the end of the war, the Sherman was everywhere. Over 49,000 were produced. It fought in North Africa, Italy, France, the Ardennes, the Pacific, and even alongside Soviet forces through Lend-Lease. If the Sherman was truly inferior, how did it become one of the most decisive armored vehicles of the war? To answer that question, we must examine not just armor thickness or gun caliber, but doctrine, logistics, and production. When the United States began serious armored expansion in 1941, its doctrine differed sharply from Germany's. German tanks were designed for both anti-armor and infantry support roles. The same formations that broke through defensive lines also engaged enemy tanks directly. The United States separated these functions. Tank destroyer units were intended to counter enemy armor. Medium tanks like the Sherman were meant to exploit breakthroughs, support infantry, and maneuver aggressively. The M4 Sherman reflected this doctrine. Its early models mounted a 75mm gun optimized for high-explosive shells. This made it effective against infantry positions, anti-tank guns, and fortifications. Against early German Panzer III and IV models, the Sherman was fully competitive. But war evolves. By 1943, Germany introduced the Panther and Tiger tanks in increasing numbers. These vehicles featured thicker frontal armor and more powerful long-barrel guns. In direct frontal engagements at long range, the Sherman was at a disadvantage. This reality shaped its reputation. However, battlefield effectiveness is not determined by isolated one-on-one comparisons. It is determined by how a system functions within its environment. The Sherman's design emphasized reliability. Its engine was robust. Its mechanical components were accessible. It could travel long distances without catastrophic failure. In contrast, German heavy tanks were mechanically complex and maintenance-intensive. Panthers in particular suffered from early transmission and engine failures. A tank that exists on paper, but breaks down on the road, does not control territory. The Sherman could move, and movement was power. Production numbers tell a larger story. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panthers and 1,300 Tigers. The United States produced nearly 50,000 Shermans. This disparity was not accidental. The Sherman was designed for mass production. Its components were standardized. Factories across the United States built them rapidly. Replacement vehicles could be shipped across the Atlantic in vast quantities. A destroyed Sherman could be replaced. A destroyed Panther was often irreplaceable. Logistics also favored the Sherman. American supply lines were unmatched in scale. Fuel, spare parts, ammunition, and trained mechanics followed armor divisions across Europe. A tank that can be repaired within hours returns to combat. A tank abandoned due to mechanical failure becomes scrap. Critics often cite armor penetration statistics. A Panther's 75mm KWK-42 could penetrate a Sherman frontally at long range. A Sherman's early 75mm gun struggled against a Panther's glassy plate, but armored warfare rarely occurred under ideal firing range conditions. In Normandy's hedgerows, visibility was limited. In cities and forests, engagements occurred at short range. Sherman crews adapted tactics accordingly. They used numbers. They used maneuver. They used artillery coordination. They used air support. American armored doctrine emphasized combined arms. Shermans rarely fought alone. They operated with infantry, engineers, artillery observers, and air liaison officers. German tanks, particularly in late war conditions, often fought under fuel shortages, air superiority disadvantage, and limited infantry support. The Sherman survivability also evolved. Early models did suffer from ammunition fires when penetrated. But by mid-war, the introduction of wet stowage, ammunition stored in water-jacketed compartments, significantly reduced catastrophic fires. Statistical studies after implementation showed a dramatic drop in burn rates. The Ronson nickname persisted, but the engineering problem had been addressed. Later Shermans also mounted improved guns. The 76mm high-velocity gun increased anti-armor capability. British forces developed the Firefly variant, mounting the powerful 17-pounder gun, capable of penetrating Panthers and Tigers effectively. These upgrades demonstrate something important. The Sherman platform was adaptable. Its turret ring allowed modification. Its chassis supported different roles. Tank destroyer variants, recovery vehicles, flamethrower tanks, amphibious DD version for D-Day. German heavy tanks were powerful but specialized. The Sherman was flexible. Flexibility wins campaigns. When American forces advanced across France after the breakout from Normandy, speed mattered more than armor thickness. Sherman-equipped divisions moved rapidly, exploiting German retreat. During the Battle of the Bulge, Shermans fought in defensive conditions against heavier German armor. Losses occurred, but so did victories. German units could not sustain prolonged offensives due to fuel shortages and air attacks. The Sherman's mechanical reliability allowed American forces to maintain pressure. In the Pacific, the Sherman's role shifted again. Japanese armor was limited and generally inferior. Shermans provided infantry support against fortified positions. Their high explosive shells proved effective in bunker clearing. Armor thickness mattered less than coordination with infantry and engineers. The Sherman was not the most heavily armored tank of the war. It was not the most powerful gun platform. It was not designed for individual duels. It was designed to be part of a system. And that system included industrial capacity, ocean transport, spare parts distribution, fuel supply dominance, air superiority, artillery integration. When comparing tanks, it is tempting to isolate technical specifications, armor thickness in millimeters, gun velocity in meters per second, penetration at 1,000 meters. But wars are not decided by specifications alone. They are decided by production, sustainment, and doctrine. A Panther might win a duel. A Sherman division might win a campaign. German tank crews were often highly skilled and tactically proficient. But skill cannot compensate indefinitely for mechanical unreliability and numerical inferiority. By 1945, American armored forces advanced across Germany with overwhelming logistical backing. Shermans continued to serve, not because they were perfect, but because they were available. Available in numbers, available with fuel, available with spare parts, available with trained crews. The Sherman's greatest strength was not its gun. It was its ecosystem. The tank represented an industrial philosophy. Better to field 10 reliable tanks than one exceptional one that cannot be replaced. Better to design for mass production than mechanical perfection. Better to integrate into combined arms doctrine than to dominate isolated duels. After the war, the debate over better tank persisted. Historians and enthusiasts often focus on head-to-head comparisons, but professional military analysis tends to examine outcomes. The Sherman supported advances across 2 continents. It remained operational across vast supply lines. It adapted to evolving threats. It did not need to be superior in every duel. It needed to be sufficient in every campaign. The lesson of the Sherman is not that quality does not matter. It is that quality must align with strategy. Germany pursued technical superiority. The United States pursued scalable adequacy. In a total industrial war, scalable adequacy proved decisive. The Sherman was not the most feared tank of World War II. It was the most present. And in war, presence is power. The B-17 Flying Fortress. The myth of invincibility and the reality of air war. Germany, 1943. High above the clouds, silver formations move in rigid geometry across the sky. They are not fast. They are not agile. They do not fly low. They fly in daylight. The B-17 Flying Fortress. To the American public, it became a symbol of industrial power and technological confidence. Newspapers described it as heavily armed, heavily armored, and capable of defending itself deep inside enemy territory. The name itself suggested invulnerability. Flying fortress. But by 1943, American bomber crews knew something different. Fortresses burned, fortresses fell, and daylight bombing over Germany became one of the most dangerous assignments of the war. To understand the B-17, we must separate myth from structure. When the B-17 was conceived in the 1930s, American air doctrine was built around a central belief. Strategic bombing could cripple an enemy's industrial capacity, destroy factories, destroy rail networks, destroy oil production, break the ability to wage war. Unlike European powers, the United States placed enormous faith in long-range, high-altitude precision bombing. The theory required aircraft that could fly long distances, carry heavy bomb loads, operate above most anti-aircraft fire, defend themselves without fighter escort. The B-17 was built for this theory. It carried multiple .50 caliber machine guns, eventually up to 13 in later variants. It had a robust airframe capable of absorbing damage. It operated at altitudes exceeding 25,000 feet, and it flew in tight defensive formations designed to concentrate overlapping field of fire. The concept was elegant, mutual defense through geometry. Each bomber protected the others. The formation became a flying fortress. In early operations over occupied Europe, the system appeared effective against limited fighter opposition and weaker air defenses. B-17 formations penetrated targets and returned home with manageable losses. Confidence grew. Daylight bombing would be decisive, but Germany adapted. By 1943, the Luftwaffe had reorganized its fighter defenses. Radar detection improved. Flak concentrations intensified. New fighter aircraft, such as the FW-190 and later improved Bf-109 variants, engaged bombers aggressively. The reality of unescorted daylight bombing emerged during missions such as the Schweinfurt, Regensburg raids in August and October 1943. The targets were ball-bearing factories critical to German war production. The cost was severe. In the October raid, 60 B-17s were lost out of 291 dispatched. Over 600 airmen were killed, captured, or missing. Loss rates approaching 20% were unsustainable. The myth of self-defending bomber formations collided with concentrated fighter interception. The B-17's defensive armament was formidable, but machine guns cannot match the speed and maneuverability of intercepting fighters indefinitely. German pilots developed tactics: frontal attacks exploiting weak forward coverage, coordinated strikes against formation edges, heavy cannon fire targeting engines and cockpit sections. Flak also took a toll. High-altitude bombing did not eliminate anti-aircraft danger. It concentrated it. Black bursts filled the sky over industrial centers. Even when bombers survived fighter attack, they flew through calculated barrages of explosive shells. The B-17's reputation for durability was earned. Aircraft returned with shredded wings, missing tail sections, and damaged engines. Crews told stories of bombers limping home on 2 engines. The airframe was strong, but durability does not equal invincibility. The turning point did not come from thicker armor or more machine guns. It came from range. The introduction of long-range escort fighters, most decisively the P-51 Mustang, changed the equation. With external fuel tanks, Mustangs could accompany bomber formations deep into Germany. Fighter escort transformed strategic bombing. Instead of relying solely on defensive geometry, bombers now had offensive protection. German interceptors faced not just offensive gunfire, but aggressive fighter opposition. Attrition shifted. Luftwaffe losses mounted. Air superiority gradually tilted toward the Allies. The B-17's doctrine did not collapse. It evolved. Daylight bombing continued, but now as part of a combined air campaign. The B-17 also reveals a broader truth about industrial war. Over 12,000 B-17s were produced. Losses were heavy, but production absorbed them. Crews trained continuously. Replacement aircraft arrived. The American industrial base sustained strategic bombing despite catastrophic missions. Germany, by contrast, struggled to replace experienced fighter pilots. The B-17 was not invincible. It was replaceable. Replaceability is strategic power. Strategic bombing itself remains debated. Did bombing alone cripple Germany? Historians argue over its efficiency. But oil production disruption in 1944 had measurable impact. Synthetic fuel plants became primary targets. German armored operations suffered fuel shortages. Aircraft production was relocated underground at enormous cost. The bombing campaign forced resource diversion. Air defense, flak production, radar networks all consumed manpower and material. The B-17 did not win the war alone, but it imposed structural strain. It forced Germany to defend its skies continuously. It shaped the battlefield before ground forces advanced. The myth of the flying fortress simplifies the story. It suggests technological superiority guaranteed safety. The reality was harsher. Victory required adaptation. Escort fighters, improved tactics, target prioritization, relentless production. The B-17 symbolized American confidence in air power. It also exposed the limits of theory when confronted by determined defense. Without escort, losses were unacceptable. With escort, the air campaign became sustainable. The flying fortress was not a fortress alone. It was one component of a growing system of air dominance. By 1945, Allied bombers operated with overwhelming escort protection. German cities lay devastated. Industrial output faltered. Airfields were cratered. Fuel reserves dwindled. The B-17 had transitioned from bold experiment to instrument of systematic attrition. After the war, strategic bombing doctrine continued to shape military planning. The B-17's legacy extended into the Cold War. High-altitude bombers remained central to nuclear strategy. But lessons from 1943 endured. No bomber is invulnerable. No formation defends itself indefinitely. Air superiority depends on integration, not isolation. The flying fortress was powerful. It was resilient. It was costly. Its true strength was not invincibility. It was the industrial and doctrinal system that sustained it. In the sky over Europe, aluminum, fuel, training, and mathematics determined survival as much as courage. The B-17 did not prove that bombers could fight alone. It proved that war is won by systems, of production, protection, and persistence. And in 1943, persistence mattered more than myth. The Battle of Kursk, when Germany lost initiative forever. July 1943. The map bulged outward around the Soviet city of Kursk. After the German defeat at Stalingrad, the Eastern Front did not collapse. It stabilized. In the center of the line, a massive salient formed Soviet-held territory, protruding westward into German positions. To Adolf Hitler and the German High Command, it presented both danger and opportunity. Danger, because it threatened future Soviet offensives. Opportunity, because it could be pinched off. The operation would be called Operation Citadel. It would become the largest tank battle in history, and it would mark the last major German offensive in the East. Germany's situation in early 1943 was complex. Stalingrad had been catastrophic. An entire army destroyed. Hundreds of thousands lost. Yet German forces remained deep inside Soviet territory. Hitler believed a decisive blow could restore initiative. The plan seemed straightforward. Attack the Kursk salient from north and south simultaneously. Encircle Soviet forces inside the bulge. Destroy them. Shorten the front. Regain strategic momentum. But the situation had changed. In 1941, Germany attacked an unprepared Soviet Union. In 1943, the Red Army knew exactly where the blow would fall. Soviet intelligence, fed by reconnaissance and Allied information, confirmed German intentions. Instead of launching a premature offensive, Soviet command made a deliberate decision: absorb the attack, bleed the Wehrmacht, then counterattack. The Germans delayed the offensive repeatedly. They waited for new weapons: Panther tanks, Tiger tanks, Ferdinand tank destroyers. The idea was technological superiority, heavier armor, more powerful guns, decisive advantage. But delay came at a cost. Every week allowed the Soviets to deepen defenses. Minefields stretched for miles. Anti-tank guns were layered in belts. Trenches and fortifications multiplied. The Kursk salient became one of the most heavily fortified areas in military history. By July 5, 1943, when the German attack finally began, the Soviets had constructed multiple defensive lines extending over 100 miles deep, hundreds of thousands of mines, thousands of anti-tank guns, dense artillery positions. This was not 1941. It was not a fluid war of movement. It was a prepared killing ground. In the north, General Model's Ninth Army attacked toward Kursk. Progress was slow. Minefields stalled advances. New Panther tanks suffered mechanical breakdowns. The Ferdinand tank destroyers were powerful but lacked machine guns for close defense, making them vulnerable to infantry. Every mile gained cost time and armor. In the south, Field Marshal Manstein's forces advanced more effectively. Elite SS Panzer divisions pushed forward toward Prokhorovka. There, on July 12th, one of the most famous armored clashes occurred. Soviet T-34s charged into German formations at close range. The battle at Prokhorovka has often been described as a chaotic, massive tank collision. In reality, it was brutal and costly for both sides. The Soviets suffered heavy losses, but they achieved something critical. They stopped the advance. The German offensive slowed. Momentum stalled. While the battle raged, events elsewhere intervened. On July 10th, Allied forces landed in Sicily. Hitler's attention shifted. Resources were finite. Germany could not sustain massive offensives on multiple fronts indefinitely. By mid-July, Operation Citadel was called off. The offensive had not achieved encirclement. It had not destroyed Soviet reserves. It had not restored initiative. Instead, it had consumed valuable armored strength. The Soviets immediately launched counteroffensives. Operation Kutuzov in the north. Operation Rumiantsev in the south. The Red Army did not pause. It attacked. And from that point forward, Germany would fight defensively on the Eastern Front. Kursk was not Germany's largest defeat in terms of casualties. It was not as shocking as Stalingrad, but it was decisive in a different way. It marked the end of German strategic initiative in the East. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht would never again launch a major sustained offensive against the Red Army. From summer 1943 onward, Soviet forces advanced steadily westward. The industrial balance had shifted irreversibly. The Soviet Union outproduced Germany in tanks, artillery, and aircraft. T-34 production dwarfed German Panther output. Losses could be replaced. Territory could be regained. Germany's new tanks were technically formidable. The Panther's long-barrel 75mm gun was deadly. The Tiger's armor was thick. But advanced machines cannot compensate for strategic imbalance. Mechanical reliability remained an issue. Fuel shortages grew worse. Air superiority increasingly favored the Soviets. The Kursk offensive was Germany's last attempt to regain control through concentrated armored force. It failed not because German tanks were weak. It failed because the conditions of 1943 were different from 1941. The Red Army had learned. It prepared layered defense. It absorbed shock. It counterattacked with depth. And perhaps most importantly, Soviet industry, relocated east of the Urals, continued to produce weapons at staggering rates. The myth of Kursk often focuses on numbers. Largest tank battle, thousands of armored vehicles. But numbers alone do not explain its significance. Kursk demonstrated that Germany could no longer dictate the pace of war in the East. Even with new heavy armor, even with elite divisions, even with careful planning, the initiative had shifted permanently. After 1943, the Eastern Front became a relentless retreat. Cities that had fallen in 1941 were retaken. Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, eventually Berlin itself. The lesson of Kursk is not that Germany lacked powerful weapons. It is that powerful weapons cannot reverse industrial and strategic momentum once lost. Delaying the offensive to wait for superior tanks allowed the enemy to fortify. Technological improvement could not overcome numerical depth. The Red Army paid dearly in blood, but it achieved its objective. It broke the last major German offensive capacity in the East. When historians identify turning points, they often point to Stalingrad, but Kursk solidified that turning point. After Kursk, the outcome in the East was no longer a question of possibility. It was a question of time. Germany would fight skillfully. It would counterattack locally. It would deploy advanced tanks and defensive tactics. But it would never regain strategic initiative. Kursk was the moment the war's direction became irreversible. The battlefield stretched from the Black Sea to the Baltic. But from July 1943 onward, it moved in one direction, west. The Battle of Midway, for carriers in 15 minutes. June 4, 1942. The Pacific Ocean appeared calm. Thousands of miles from mainland America, a small atoll named Midway sat almost unnoticed in the vastness of the sea. It was little more than a coral ring with an airstrip, yet within hours, it would become the pivot point of the Pacific War. The Japanese Empire entered 1942 undefeated. Pearl Harbor had crippled the U.S. battleship fleet. The Philippines were collapsing. Singapore had fallen. Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies. Their navy had executed complex carrier operations with precision. They believed momentum was irreversible. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sought one decisive battle. His objective was simple: destroy the remaining American aircraft carriers. Without them, the Pacific would belong to Japan. The Japanese plan was elaborate. A diversionary attack in the Aleutian Islands would draw American attention north. Meanwhile, the main carrier force, for fleet carriers, would approach Midway. They would bomb the island, lure out American carriers, and destroy them in open battle. The carriers chosen for the operation were veterans: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. These ships had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack. Their air crews were experienced and confident. The Japanese believed the United States had only 2 carriers operational in the Pacific. They were wrong. American codebreakers had achieved something critical. They had broken key portions of the Japanese naval code. They knew Midway was a target. They knew approximate timing. They knew enough. Admiral Chester Nimitz made a calculated decision. Instead of retreating to protect the West Coast, he would ambush the Japanese fleet. The United States assembled 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown. Yorktown had been damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. Repair crews worked around the clock in Pearl Harbor. What was expected to take months was accomplished in days. Yorktown sailed to join the trap. At dawn on June 4th, Japanese aircraft struck Midway Island. The airfield was damaged but not destroyed. Meanwhile, American scout planes searched desperately for the Japanese fleet. Both sides were hunting each other. Timing would decide everything. Japanese Admiral Nagumo faced a dilemma. His first strike had not neutralized Midway's defenses. He prepared a second wave. But while rearming aircraft for another strike on the island, reports arrived. American ships had been sighted. Nagumo hesitated. Should he launch immediately with aircraft armed for ground attack, or rearm with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for anti-ship combat? He chose to rearm. Aircraft were brought below deck. Bombs were removed. Torpedoes were loaded. Fuel lines ran across hangar decks. In that moment, the Japanese carriers were at their most vulnerable. American torpedo bombers arrived first. Flying low and slow, with obsolete aircraft and minimal fighter protection, they attacked bravely. They were slaughtered. Squadrons were decimated. Few torpedoes hit their targets. It appeared the Japanese defenses were working flawlessly, but the sacrifice was not meaningless. Japanese fighters were pulled down to low altitude. Airspace above the fleet became less protected. Then, almost by accident, American dive bombers found the Japanese carriers. At 10:22 a.m., in a window measured in minutes, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown descended from high altitude. They encountered minimal resistance. Within 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were fatally damaged. Bombs struck hangars filled with fueled and armed aircraft. Explosions cascaded. Fires spread uncontrollably. The decks that had launched victory at Pearl Harbor were now engulfed in flame. Hiryu, the fourth carrier, remained operational. It launched counterstrikes that crippled Yorktown. But later that afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu as well. She too was mortally wounded. By nightfall, 4 of Japan's frontline fleet carriers were lost. So were hundreds of experienced pilots and crew. Midway was not the largest naval battle of the war, but its consequences were profound. Japan could replace ships. It could not easily replace veteran aviators. Carrier warfare depends not only on hulls and aircraft, it depends on trained air crews. The Japanese Naval Air Arm had spent years building elite pilot cadres. Midway shattered that core. American losses were significant but sustainable. The United States possessed industrial capacity beyond Japan's reach. New carriers were already under construction. New pilots were training in large numbers. Japan's offensive momentum stalled. From that point forward, the Pacific War shifted gradually. The United States moved from defense to offense. Guadalcanal followed, then island-hopping campaigns across the Central Pacific. Japan never again achieved strategic initiative comparable to early 1942. Midway also demonstrated something critical about modern naval warfare. Battleships no longer decided outcomes. Aircraft carriers did. The battle was fought almost entirely by planes launched from ships that never saw each other directly. Information, reconnaissance, and timing mattered more than armor thickness. A few minutes of vulnerability determined the fate of fleets. Japanese planning had been complex and ambitious. American planning was simpler, but based on intelligence advantage. Code-breaking proved as decisive as bombs. Luck played a role. So did courage. So did error. Nagumo's hesitation, understandable under pressure, proved costly. American torpedo squadrons suffered devastating losses, yet their attack disrupted Japanese defenses. Dive bomber squadrons arrived at precisely the right moment. War rarely unfolds according to perfect logic. Midway was shaped by preparation and chance. After the battle, the Pacific balance shifted. Japan retained significant naval strength, but it no longer possessed clear superiority. The United States, backed by enormous shipbuilding programs, began launching new Essex-class carriers. Production outpaced Japanese capacity. By 1943 and 1944, American carrier task forces dwarfed earlier fleets. Midway was a turning point because it halted expansion. It forced Japan into strategic defense. It bought time, and time favored the United States. The Pacific War would continue for 3 more years. It would consume islands, fleets, cities, and lives. But after June 1942, its direction changed. The initiative moved east to west, from Midway to Tokyo Bay. The lesson of Midway is not simply that 4 carriers were lost. It is that momentum can collapse suddenly, that intelligence can offset numerical disadvantage, that industrial capacity determines whether losses are survivable, and that in modern war, 15 minutes can alter history. The Pacific Ocean is vast. But in June 1942, its balance shifted in a narrow slice of sky above a coral atoll. 4 carriers burned, an empire's advance halted, and the long road to Tokyo began. STG-44, the weapon that arrived too late. Eastern Front, 1944. A German infantry unit takes position along a tree line. Soviet troops advance across broken terrain at less than 200 meters. The German soldiers do not fire single, deliberate bolt-action shots. They fire in bursts. Short, controlled automatic fire. Not from a machine gun. From rifles. The weapon in their hands is the Sturmgewehr 44. The name means storm rifle. In English, it would become something else. Assault rifle. But in 1944, it was not yet a category. It was an experiment born from necessity. And it appeared at the moment when Germany could no longer afford experiments. The German army entered World War II with a clear infantry doctrine. The machine gun was the center of the squad. The Kar 98K bolt-action rifle supported it. Riflemen fired accurately but slowly. Machine guns provided volume. This system worked in Poland and France. But on the vast expanses of the Eastern Front, new realities emerged. Combat ranges were often under 300 meters. Engagements were fluid and close. Urban fighting increased. Forest fighting increased. Soviet infantry employed large numbers of submachine guns, particularly the PPSH-41. German units began to recognize a gap. Bolt-action rifles offered accuracy and range. Submachine guns offered high volume of fire at short range. Neither offered both in one platform. German planners asked a radical question. What if a rifle fired a smaller cartridge? Not a pistol round. Not a full-power rifle cartridge. Something in between. The result was a 7.92 by 33 millimeters Kurz cartridge, shorter than the standard 7.92 by 57 millimeters Mauser. Reduced recoil, reduced effective range, but controllable in automatic fire. This was a conceptual shift. For decades, armies assumed that full-power rifle cartridges were necessary for infantry combat, but battlefield data suggested most engagement occurred under 300 meters. The extra range was rarely decisive. Controllable automatic fire at realistic combat distances might be more valuable. The first prototypes appeared as the Maskin & Karabiner 42, MKB-42. Development continued under shifting designations. Hitler initially opposed the project. He believed in full-power rifles. He resisted the idea of intermediate ammunition. To continue development, the weapon was temporarily labeled as a submachine gun. Eventually, after field reports praised its performance, Hitler approved it and renamed it personally. Sturmgewehr, Storm Rifle. The name was propaganda. The concept was revolutionary. Technically, the STG-44 was advanced. It fired from a closed bolt. It used a gas-operated system with a tilting bolt. It fed from a 30-round detachable magazine. It allowed both semi-automatic and fully automatic fire. Its effective range was approximately 300 to 400 meters. Its recoil was manageable. Its production relied heavily on stamped steel components. This was not a refined, polished weapon. It was industrial and practical. On the battlefield, it impressed soldiers. German infantry who received it appreciated the ability to deliver sustained fire without relying solely on machine guns. In urban combat and forest fighting, it proved highly effective. Short bursts could suppress advancing troops. The weapon blended the controllability of a submachine gun with the range of a rifle. It represented the future. But it was 1944. Production numbers tell the deeper story. Approximately 425,000 STG-44 rifles were produced before the end of the war. This was significant for Germany. It was insignificant compared to Allied production. The United States produced over 5 million M1 Garands. The Soviet Union produced millions of submachine guns and rifles. Germany introduced a revolutionary weapon at the moment its industry was under relentless bombing. Factories were disrupted. Supply chains were strained. Fuel shortages intensified. The STG-44 required a new ammunition type. That meant new production lines, new logistics, new distribution systems. In a collapsing war economy, complexity was a liability. Many German units never received the STG-44. Those that did often lacked sufficient ammunition. Some soldiers were issued rifles without adequate magazines. Training was limited. The weapon could not reshape doctrine in time. It arrived in fragments. Meanwhile, the Red Army advanced relentlessly. Soviet forces did not rely on revolutionary small arms. They relied on mass production. The T-34 tank, the PPSH-41, the Mosin-Nagant rifle. They were not perfect. They were abundant. Germany pursued technological solutions to strategic problems. The STG-44 was one such solution. It addressed a real tactical need, but it could not solve industrial imbalance. It could not reverse air superiority. It could not replace lost armor divisions. It could not compensate for oil shortages. The weapon was correct. The timing was fatal. After the war, the significance of the STG-44 became clearer. Its intermediate cartridge concept influenced the Soviet AK-47. Western nations also moved toward selective fire rifles. The distinction between rifle and submachine gun blurred permanently. The assault rifle became standard. The STG-44 did not win the war, but it defined the next generation of infantry weapons. It demonstrated that most combat occurs at moderate ranges. It demonstrated that controllable automatic fire at those ranges is decisive. It demonstrated that lighter ammunition allows soldiers to carry more rounds. These lessons endured. The irony of the STG-44 is stark. It was arguably the most forward-looking infantry weapon of the war. It embodied the future of small arms. Yet it was fielded by a nation whose strategic position was collapsing. It could win engagements. It could not win campaigns. Germany recognized the evolution of infantry combat, but recognition without resources is insufficient. The STG-44 remains a symbol of innovation under pressure, a glimpse of what modern warfare would become, and a reminder that technological brilliance cannot overcome strategic reality. In 1944, German soldiers carried the future in their hands. They just carried it too late. The U-boat campaign, how Germany nearly won the Atlantic and why it failed. Atlantic Ocean, 1942. At night, the sea is black and empty. A convoy moves slowly across it. Cargo ships packed with fuel, ammunition, food, trucks, aircraft parts. Everything Britain needs to survive. Beneath the surface, steel waits. A German Type 7 U-boat tracks the convoy through its periscope. 1 torpedo. 2. A freighter erupts in flame. In 1942, it appeared that Germany might win the Battle of the Atlantic. If Britain could be starved, the war would end. But 3 years later, the U-boat fleet was shattered. The Atlantic was secure. Germany had lost a war at sea. The question is not whether U-boats were effective. They were. The question is why they ultimately failed. When war began in 1939, Admiral Karl Dönitz understood something clearly. Germany could not defeat the Royal Navy in surface combat. Battleships were too expensive. Shipyards were too few. Britain controlled the sea lanes. Instead, Germany would attack trade. Sink merchant ships faster than Britain could replace them. Choke supply. This was not new. It was a continuation of World War I strategy. But in 1939, the tools were improved. The Type 7 U-boat was compact, efficient, and deadly. It could operate across the North Atlantic. It carried torpedoes and a deck gun, and it operated in groups. Wolfpacks. Instead of attacking alone, submarines coordinated. One boat would shadow a convoy and radio its position. Others would converge. At night, they would surface, faster and harder to detect, and strike. In 1940 and 1941, the results were devastating. Merchant ships burned. Convoys scattered. Britain's survival depended on imports. Food, fuel, raw materials. If shipping losses exceeded replacement rates, collapse would follow. Dönitz calculated that 300 operational submarines could force Britain to surrender. In 1939, he had fewer than 60, but production accelerated. Then came 1942. After the United States entered the war, American coastal defenses were unprepared. Lights from cities silhouetted ships. Convoys were poorly organized. U-boats operated off the U.S. East Coast almost without opposition. This period became known as the Second Happy Time. Tonnage sunk reached alarming levels. It appeared Dönitz's strategy might succeed. But war is not static. The Allies adapted. Convoys became standard and disciplined. Escort ships increased. Destroyers, corvettes, and frigates were assigned to protect merchant shipping. Technology began to shift the balance. Radar improved detection of surface submarines. High-frequency direction finding, HF/DF, allowed Allied forces to locate U-boat radio transmissions. Aircraft patrol coverage expanded. Long-range bombers like the B-24 Liberator closed the air gap in the mid-Atlantic, the region previously beyond air escort range. Depth charges improved. Then came a small but decisive innovation. The escort carrier, small aircraft carriers assigned directly to convoys. Now, aircraft could patrol above merchant fleets continuously. The ocean was no longer empty. U-boats that once hunted freely were themselves hunted. Production numbers reveal the deeper imbalance. Germany built over 1,100 Type 7 submarines during the war, but Allied shipyards produced Liberty ships at astonishing rates. American industrial output overwhelmed attrition. Even when U-boats sank ships, replacements arrived. Dönitz's calculation, sink faster than they build, failed once U.S. industry mobilized fully. The decisive year was 1943. In May alone, Germany lost 41 submarines. Loss rates became unsustainable. Improved Allied anti-submarine tactics combined air and surface coordination. Convoys no longer scattered in panic. They fought back. U-boats were forced to spend more time submerged to avoid detection. But submerged, they were slower, less effective. The wolfpack tactic depended on communication. Radio signals now betrayed positions. Technology had reversed the advantage. Germany attempted innovation. The Type XXI submarine, revolutionary in design, was faster underwater than surfaced. It could have changed submarine warfare. But like many late-war German innovations, it arrived too late. Few were operational before the war ended. Meanwhile, Allied shipyards launched vessels continuously. Oil flowed from North America. Troops crossed the Atlantic in safety. The invasion of Normandy in 1944 would have been impossible without control of sea lanes. By 1945, the U-boat arm was shattered. Over 700 German submarines were lost. Thousands of sailors died. The campaign had come close to success. But close is meaningless in industrial war. The U-boat campaign demonstrates a structural lesson. Submarines were tactically brilliant. Wolfpack coordination was innovative. German crews were disciplined and skilled. But strategic warfare requires more than tactical success. Germany underestimated American industrial capacity, Allied technological adaptation, the speed of countermeasure development. At the start of the war, the Atlantic belonged to submarines. By the end, it belonged to aircraft and radar. The invisible ocean became transparent. The hunter became visible. Invisibility is death in submarine warfare. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest campaign of World War II. It began in 1939. It ended only in May 1945. It never produced a single dramatic turning point like Midway. It was a war of mathematics. Tonnage sunk versus tonnage built. Submarines launched versus submarines destroyed. In the end, industry won. Technology accelerated. Adaptation prevailed. Germany nearly strangled Britain. But nearly is not enough. The Atlantic remained open. And because it remained open, the United States could bring its full power to Europe. The U-boats did not fail because they were ineffective. They failed because the war became larger than submarines. In 1942, the ocean seemed to belong to them. By 1944, it no longer did. And once the Atlantic was secure, Germany's fate on land was sealed.